Thank you for joining our webinar today to provide you with an overview of the Uniform Closing Dataset, or UCD, mandate. My name is Alyssa Grover, and I'm the Senior Product Marketing Manager here for Ellie Mae. I'm pleased to kick off this webinar today, but first I will be covering some housekeeping items. For best viewing experience, you can expand your slide area by clicking on the Maximize icon on the top right of the slide area. If you're listening through the phone today, please mute your computer speakers to avoid hearing an echo. And if you're listening through your computer speakers, check your volume on your speakers so that you can hear properly. We have allocated time for Q&A midway through the presentation and at the conclusion. However, if you'd like to submit a question during the webinar, please do so by typing your questions in the Q&A pod and click the Submit button. We'll try to answer all of those questions by the end of the session today. We are not recording the webinar today at the request of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. However, the presentation materials will be provided to attendees afterwards. Before I introduce today's presenters, I want to remind everyone that our presentation may contain forward-looking statements about the timing of certain system features. In addition, the content of this webinar presentation is intended as general information for attendees today, and the content is confidential to Ellie Mae. Now, I would like to introduce today's presenters. Joining us today is Kelly Vespucci, Project Management for Fannie Mae. Kelly's a subject matter expert and project manager on the Uniform Closing Disclosure team. In her nearly 20 years at Fannie Mae, she has served as an underwriting consultant, risk manager, product manager, and has worked on the UCD team since its inception in 2013. Prior to joining Fannie Mae, Kelly served as Director of Homeownership for 2 different state housing finance agencies and as president of a small escrow closing firm in the Pacific Northwest. Also joining us today is Kathy Scanlon, Single Family Strategic Delivery for Freddie Mac. Kathy is a senior project manager in Freddie Mac's UCD and loan closing advisor with Freddie Mac's UCD Collection Solution. Freddie Mac's Single Family Offerings Division has managed the development and the deployment activities associated with the Uniform Closing Dataset since its inception in 2013. Kathy has been with Freddie Mac for 15 years, and during this time, she's led many initiatives in the single family and capital market divisions, including new product, process, and system implementation, as well as management of Freddie Mac's Loan Prospector and Home Value Explorer and e-mortgage offerings. And also joining us today is John Herring, Ellie Mae's own Director of Compliance Enablement, who will be our host today. As Ellie Mae's Director of Compliance Enablement, John is responsible for facilitating regulatory changes across the Ellie Mae suite of products. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to John. John?
Hey, Alyssa, thank you so much. And thank you to all for taking time out of your busy days to join us here today. I think whether you are new to the concept of what UCD is, or you're familiar with it in concept and are thinking about now how it's going to be implemented for delivery next year, you're going to find this webinar extremely useful, as not only are we going to talk a little bit about the background and the why and the what is UCD, but we're also going to talk about some specific issues that you should be incorporating into your implementation plans. We are going to talk a little bit towards the end about what Ellie Mae has done in order to facilitate this reporting requirement, but I think you're going to get some very useful information about things that you need to consider that are going to be part of your workflow in order to make this a successful implementation. So with that, looking over the agenda today, Kathy is going to give us some good background and overview about what the UCD mandate is, as well as the timing requirements. There's some very good information there I think you're going to want to pay particular attention to, especially if you've been keeping up to date with UCD conversations and requirements. And then we'll also refer to how the GSEs plan on collecting UCD data next year. And then Kelly is going to talk about some very specific issues that lenders are going to want to start getting familiar with and planning on how to address when it comes to UCD delivery. And I'll come back in towards the end and talk about what Ellie Mae has already done in recent releases and anything that might be on the horizon coming up shortly. Throughout this, we are going to be taking questions through the Q&A pod. Because we do have a very large attendance of audience today, I'm going to ask that you please help self-monitor the questions that are coming in. For example, we have already indicated that copies of the slides will be made available after this presentation. There is no need from this point forward for anyone to ask whether or not they're going to get a copy of the slides. So if you could help us keep the questions on point and on topic, that will increase the odds that we'll be able to address them during the webinar today. So with that final housekeeping note, let me go ahead and turn it over to Kathy Scanlon with Freddie Mac to take us a little bit more into what is the UCD. Kathy?
Great, thank you, John. Hello, everyone. Before we talk about UCD, I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about the Uniform Mortgage Data Program. So the UCD is an initiative that falls under the UMDP, or Uniform Mortgage Data Program, umbrella. And the UMDP is an effort that was undertaken jointly by Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae in 2010, and its goals are to achieve greater standardization of data across the loan lifecycle, process efficiencies across the industry, more effective risk management, and improvements to data quality, consistency, and accuracy of loan, borrower, and property data, again, throughout the mortgage lifecycle. So this results in loans now being delivered with more granular data using standardized MISMO terms, definitions, and formats. So we have a number of initiatives under our UMDP umbrella. Our first one was the Uniform Loan Delivery Dataset, or ULDD. Then came the Uniform Appraisal Dataset, or UAD, the Uniform Closing Dataset, which we're here to talk to you about today, and our most recent one is ULAD, or Uniform Loan Application Dataset. But again, we're here today to talk to you about UCD, so we'll go into a little bit more detail about that. So what is the UCD? The UCD was designed to provide a standardized data set that allows the information on the closing disclosure to be communicated electronically. It was developed using both the closing disclosure form, but more importantly, the trade regulation. So why are the GSEs so interested in this information? The UCD is going to help us enhance risk management with more data and better quality data. It enhances our ability to detect ineligible loans and eligibility concerns, and also gives us a wealth of information that we can use to better detect fraud and misrepresentation. There are, we believe, benefits to the industry as well. So some of the benefits to the lenders is, again, it's that consistent approach and common language to convey the same information. That in turn leads to better data integration and easier, more efficient exchange of information. And again, just as in the case of the GSEs, it should also flow to the lender that understanding of the data will be greatly enhanced using, again, the consistent approach and the common language. So now we'll talk a little bit about how and when we are collecting the UCD. So Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae have implemented separate collection solutions for the Uniform Closing Data Set, but are aligned on the UCD format. In other words, the data set is exactly the same for Freddie Mac as for Fannie Mae. And we are also aligned when in the process it will be collected, which is at or before loan delivery. Both GSEs have manual upload capability in their applications, as well as a direct or system-to-system integration. Some additional things we're aligned on: UCD file format. Again, that's the same among the GSEs. Data conditionality and conditionality details. The mandate date for delivery will be the same for Freddie Mac and for Fannie Mae. Adequate time for testing and delivery, and commitment and to support vendors and lenders as they work to implement the UCD. Some of the differences between Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, again, our testing and collection mechanisms are different. Our testing and system implementation timelines are different, and what that means is it just means that we stood up our systems at different points in time, but as of today, they are both GSEs have those solutions up and running and available for testing. And obviously, our training and support materials are geared to our specific collection solutions, so therefore are different. We have a wealth of information, each GSE does, on our UCD web pages. So FreddieMac.com, FannieMae.com, we each have a UCD web page that has a wealth of information about UCD and about our collection solutions.
Kathy, this is John Herring. Do you mind if I pause for one quick question for our audience?
Not at all.
So a lot of folks are asking a question about, for example, if they are a correspondent, if they're not a seller servicer. Could you maybe touch for a moment around who is expected to deliver a UCD export?
Certainly. So ultimately, for us, the party responsible for ensuring that Freddie Mac and Kelly, you can jump in, but I think it's the same for Fannie Mae. The party that's ultimately responsible for ensuring a delivery of a UCD file is the lender selling us the loan. However, Freddie Mac and I believe Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, we have implemented a correspondent assignment solution. So correspondents have the ability to log into our loan closing advisor application, which is our UCD collection tool, and upload their UCD, receive results, and assign those to an aggregator. So the method of access is a little bit different than it is for a seller, but certainly we encourage you to reach out to your account rep if you have one, or if not, certainly contact our customer support center.
And it's probably worth mentioning that this is not only for those that are selling directly to the GSEs, either Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, but also if you're selling to an aggregator who in turn might be selling, they will have their own requirements. I saw, for example, Wells Fargo just made their announcement the other day in support of this initiative.
Yes, yes. Thanks, John. And yeah, just the one thing I'd like to add is if you're an aggregator and your correspondents are delivering the UCD, that meets our UCD requirement, and what that means is that the aggregator does not have to redeliver the UCD. Just a little bit of clarity
Great.
there.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Appreciate that.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about timing. So as we mentioned in the previous slide, both GSE collection solutions are now available for testing and delivery of the UCD file. Beginning on September 25th, 2017, the UCD XML file and associated PDF are required to be delivered for all loans with a note date of September 25th, 2017 or later. We are requiring at that point the borrower data and closing disclosure only. So in the case of a split disclosure, we are not requiring the seller side of the transaction. However, we would encourage you to deliver the seller side of the transaction if you have it, if you've implemented that capability. Because what that does is it gets you familiar with each of our collection solutions, our distinctive messaging, because each GSE will have its own messaging and format of those messaging. So we would encourage you to deliver it if you have it, but it is not required until later in 2018. So what we thought would be helpful, we recognized and we heard that this was a large challenge for the industry. It was a big process change. So Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae got together and we worked it out. We decided we can give the industry a break. Let's collect the borrower side and we'll collect the seller side a year later. So an exact date for that hasn't been determined, but you can figure it'll be sometime late third quarter of 2018. Okay. All right, so that's a little bit about timing. So things to remember when you're preparing to deliver the UCD to us. The UCD is based on the MISMO 3.3.0 format. Again, the UCD XML file is the same for both GSEs. There's no Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac specific data requirements. The delivery of the UCD must occur prior to delivery. And really what that means is it must occur anytime before, even if it could be a minute before you deliver the loan. But it needs to be before delivery. We need to be in possession of it before you deliver the loan to us. So the UCD XML file must comply with the data requirements in Appendix HI, which is our UCD delivery specification. That can be found, again, on each GSE's respective websites. The GSEs are not requiring signatures on the closing disclosure at this time. And a PDF of the most recent closing disclosure, including any addenda, must be embedded in the UCD XML file. The data provided in the UCD XML file must match the data on the PDF. Okay, so we've, as we've worked with our lenders, as we've worked with industry, one of the big questions that come up is, what if it changes? What if the closing disclosure changes? What if the data changes? So we have come out with redelivery requirements. And the first, I'll say, is that we are not requiring redelivery of the UCD in year one of the mandate. So if it changes, you can redeliver to us. You don't have to. It's not required. So in year two, we have somewhat different redelivery policies, but I'll explain why really they're not so different. So Fannie Mae, their requirement is that lenders must redeliver the UCD 90 days after acquisition if there are any changes. Lenders may redeliver earlier than 90 days if their process is designed to do so. So Freddie Mac's requirement is that lenders may redeliver the UCD for any change at any time. However, Freddie Mac will require redelivery of UC data only in the case of a material data change. And we give some examples of what a material data change would be. Top of the form change, so that's things like closing date, property address, sales price. Obviously, if the borrower or lender change, many of these things would require redisclosure anyway. But the reason I said earlier that you'll see why they're really not that different is if you're meeting Fannie Mae's requirement, you're meeting Freddie Mac's requirement. So that's the way we sort of look at it. So I think that's about it for redelivery. Again, the important things to remember are it is not required in year one of the mandate, just like seller data. And that while our redelivery policies are a little bit different, I think lenders will find as they work to implement that they're not so different. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to John.
Great, Kathy, thank you so much. So we just want to take a moment right now to focus questions specifically around either the timing, the format, or the requirements about who's going to file. So I'm looking over some of the questions that have been coming in, and it looks like there's some folks that are still just a little bit unclear, so maybe we'll pass by it one more time as to who is expected to produce a UCD export. And part of this might be understanding that even if you're not selling directly to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, if you are delivering to, let's say, Wells Fargo may require you to submit that UCD as a requirement of purchasing the loan from you, even though you're not directly selling it. So I don't know if we can.
That's correct.
If there's additional clarification helpful there. And then Kathy, you mentioned that for the first year, there's no expectations to redeliver. Just to put a fine point on that, I know it looks like we have one of the aggregators asking if the aggregator identifies that a change needs to happen to a CD, or let's say that it has happened to the CD, is that still the case where for at least the first year, redelivery is not going to be required?
That's correct. That's
So I
correct.
take it, I mean, so it's optional. It wouldn't cause an issue to redeliver, I take it.
Absolutely.
But it's not
required.
required.
That's right. You can redeliver at any point, but we are not going to require it in year one in that circumstance or any other that I can think of.
And then, okay, and then I think here in a minute we're going to talk a little bit more about some specific parameters. For example, the difference between standard and alternate version on purchase versus refi. So why don't we go ahead and move on and turn the baton to Kelly Vespucci with Fannie Mae to take us through our next slides.
Great. Thank you, John, and thank you, Kathy. In preparing for delivery of the closing disclosure, it's important to remember that there are several different types of forms that are permitted under the regulation. And this is a very different situation because, as Kathy already mentioned, we have other uniform data sets under the Uniform Mortgage Data Program, right? We've all experienced maybe preparation for the loan delivery data set and the appraisal data set, and those are things that were nascent to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, right? Those are our forms, those are our delivery information. But when we're working with the closing disclosure, we're working with a form model that comes from a federal regulation, right? It doesn't belong to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So we've created a data set that supports all the types of loans and all the types of transactions and all the types of fees, et cetera, whether the loans are GSE eligible or not, okay? And the disclosures have several forms that they may take that are permitted underneath the regulation. And the first is the model form. It's the standard form, you know, for those of you that have been using it and are familiar with those 5 pages. That's really best suited for a purchase transaction because on the 3rd page it has the summaries of transaction, right, with a borrower side and a seller side. It's very similar to what we were using previously on the HUD-1 settlement statement. So the model form is to be used on purchase transactions and includes that borrower and seller information. And when you deliver the UCD data set to Fannie Mae or to Freddie Mac, there's going to be a single PDF that's included in the XML delivery file. The GSEs have chosen for refinance transactions to only permit use of the alternate form because the alternate form is really better suited to a refinance transaction. It takes the information that's displayed on page 3 and completely changes it. The summaries of transaction section goes away and a new payoffs and payments table shows up there, and it's just much more better suited to a refinance transaction, and where the regulation allows lenders to use either the model form or the alternate form, our implementation has streamlined it and made it more simple, less complicated, because there's only one choice, only the choice of the alternate form for a refinance. And using that really, as I said, provides better standardization and clarity around the things that are unique to a refinance transaction. And again, there's a single PDF included in that situation. The regulation also permits the use of a split disclosure, where you're only showing borrower information to the borrower and seller information to the seller, and they are each presented with their own version of a closing disclosure, which they review. And there is some common information that's shared just to identify the transaction, but the information is much more split between what's important to a borrower and what's important to the seller. In the case of the use of the split disclosures, obviously, purchase transactions can use that. On a refinance, there isn't a seller, right? So you're never going to have a split disclosure. You're going to use a purchase transaction with a borrower only. Again, a single PDF is included there. And if you use the split disclosure with the seller side, it's going to include seller data. And both PDFs, the borrower PDF and seller PDF, need to be included in that XML file transmission. It's also important to know when embedding the closing disclosure in the XML file that each uniform closing data set has to have the corresponding closing disclosure embedded in it. That PDF must be present. And the information in the data set has to match the embedded closing disclosure that you're including. And an embedded PDF has to be a clear copy. We're not specifying what kind of technology you're using in order to embed it. We're just saying that it needs to be a clear copy. And if you have that split disclosure situation that I've just mentioned, both the borrower and selling closing disclosures have to be included in your XML file. We've also included in the data set, and we get a lot of questions about this, the fact that there are some additional data points in the closing data set that aren't actually displayed on the forms when you produce, a physical copy of the form. And there are several here related to parts of the regulation for which lenders need to comply regarding the ability to repay qualified mortgage provisions of the regulation. So these are data points that are needed in order for lenders to compute and make the proper calculations or proper disclosures to CFPB, even though they're not present on the form. So there are several loan level data points, like ability to repay exemption reason type, if you're excluding a particular fee from the ability to repay calculation, you're having to explain why it's excluded, and the method type. Also, there's a part of the calculation regarding what the base interest rate is from which your discount points are calculated. So there's this presence of an average prime offer rate percent as a data point, and loan price quote interest rate percent, right, the basis for your interest rate. The average prime is when there's a loan that doesn't have a set interest rate at closing, which is very rare, but things like a construction loan that might be having a monthly interest-only payment during a construction phase or something like that, things that, as I said, aren't GSE eligible necessarily, but are covered under the regulation. Also an indication as to whether a refinance is being made by the same lender, because there are some different calculations for qualified mortgage based on that. And then some data points around Regulation Z, whether you're collecting fees for an affiliate affects the compliance and calculation with QM. So there's affiliate fees amount, total loan amount, and total points and fees amount for Regulations Z. And those are all loan levels. And on the fee level side, if there are bona fide discount points that are excluded from the Reg Z calculation, there's a way to capture that with an indicator and with a percentage, and also a points and fees indicator for Regulation Z at the fee level that's built into this data set. So these are things that we were mindful to include that, again, aren't necessarily displayed when you produce the physical copy of the disclosures for the consumer or for the seller, but they're built into the data set. We also get a lot of questions about the bottom of page 5, right above the signatures. There's a contact information section, which is much more detailed than has ever been provided to the consumer. And the closing disclosure requires certain licensing information at both the entity and at the individual level in this contact information section. And this is actually one of the most complex parts of the disclosure, because these columns will appear or will collapse based on whether or not these parties are even present in the transaction. So on a refinance transaction, you wouldn't even have these columns for the buyer's real estate broker and the seller's real estate broker, right? And if you had a retail origination, you wouldn't even have the presence of the mortgage broker column, right? So this section of the form is dynamic, but what we want you to focus on here is that you can see highlighted in yellow, there's requirements for the NMLS ID, state code, and license ID number for both the entity. You know, if you're a lender, you need to provide that for your company, as well as for the contact person, and works all the way across all 5 columns if all 5 columns are necessary based on the type of transaction. And we get a lot of questions about, you know, we have to provide this, what's our responsibility for this? And I think the position that both Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are taking at this point is that, you know, you need to do this on a best efforts basis. We understand that you may not have technology to validate whether these license numbers are accurate, but that most entities do some due diligence when approving the entities that they're allowing to conduct settlements for them, or the real estate brokers that are involved in the transactions, if you're able to do that due diligence. So we're requiring this information because it's required by the regulation, and that, you know, we hope you'll, you know, are able to do best efforts, you know, due diligence on the accuracy sort of that stuff, but that we're not holding you responsible necessarily for the accuracy of those license numbers. And Kathy, did you want to elaborate or confirm my temperature on that?
Yeah, I think you captured it, Kelly. I think
okay.
Your temperature is normal. You're good to go.
Thanks. So I know there's been a lot of concern and questions about that that we've experienced at Fannie Mae, and I just wanted folks to understand our position.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that Kelly said that is very important is that this is a best efforts type of thing. So there is a lot of angst around this, and which is why we've taken that position.
And this is John. Just to put a fine point on it, because we are getting a significant number of questions about this. If it doesn't apply to you, for example, if you're not required to carry a license number, or one of these parties is not required to carry a license number, again, as has been pointed out, it's really about best efforts. Submit the information you have. Exercise at least some due diligence in gathering information where it exists. And again, just best efforts. If you have it or you can get it, recommended course of action is to submit it. If you don't have it, don't sweat it. Is that, or I should say, if it doesn't exist, don't sweat it.
Exactly. And no fail edits around this, obviously. Okay. We also get a lot of questions about what are some best practices, what are some best ways to start preparing for the process changes that are coming here with implementing the Uniform Closing Data Set. And there's some suggestions of some questions here that I think are important for you to be asking your partners as you prepare for implementing the Uniform Closing Data Set. And first off is if you're a lender that's large enough to work with correspondents, you might want to begin to ask, what's their general awareness of the delivery requirement. You know, how savvy are they? What steps are they already taking? What challenges are they getting? Are they facing with getting a UCD file? Begin to have these conversations early and often and as granular as possible about your expectations, your timing, the handshakes, the responsibilities, I think is really critical. And in working with your settlement agents, you know, what plans do you have with your settlement service providers? And obviously, depending on how large your footprint is, you may be dealing with all kinds of different entities. You may be dealing with law firms in some states where attorneys are required to close loans versus title companies in some, in some jurisdictions versus escrow organizations like the one that I ran in Washington State. So you'll have different sorts of entities you're working with. So what are their plans in exchanging information, and how will you create those integrations, whether they're using technology or using other sorts of solutions? How will settlement providers know that you require the UCD, and when, and how many days worth of communication and integration are you going to need back and forth in order to comply with the requirements under the regulation? Because, the disclosure needs to be provided several days in advance, which was a big difference for the industry to absorb. So how are you going to get all of those handshakes and information back and forth? How will they know what additional data points that aren't on the loan estimate or closing disclosure are required? And do they know that the American Land Title Association can help by publishing news or press releases or things during their news cycles? There's some, there's a lot of people involved in making sure that everyone understands the requirements under the regulation, and the American Land Title Association has been very active in the the settlement service arena at making folks aware. And we've, both Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, have been very involved with them in conducting webinars and providing information. So they should leverage their relationship with ALTA and the resources that ALTA has made available as well. So just some things to sort of think about as you're working with all of your different industry partners, and questions you should be asking and getting yourselves ready. We also wanted to make mention here of some data point information, and for those of you that aren't necessarily involved in the Mortgage Industry Standards Maintenance Organization, or MISMO, we wanted you to be aware that there are these additional data points here that have been created. It has this additional licensing information which is required but not displayed on the closing disclosure. We want to know the license authority level type, for example. So when you're providing that licensing information that's in that chart we showed a couple of slides back in that contact section, we need to know at what level is that federal, local, state, or private licensing information. And again, just to reiterate, the GSEs will use this information and expect lenders to make a good faith effort, or as I said before, a best efforts to collect this data. I think at some future point in time, this is going to be very, very useful information, not only to the GSEs, but to regulators and to lenders to make sure they have right parties, right? And also to be used, at some future date in fraud investigations. It's very useful to have this kind of licensing information to identify right parties. So we're hoping that everyone understands. At this point in time, we're hoping everyone can use their best efforts to give us good licensing information, and that there are these couple of additional pieces of information. At what level is that license, and also what was the license issue date that can be useful to us for investigations at some point in the future. And I will stop here and let John go through any other questions that have popped in for us.
Great, Kelly. Thank you so much. So I think it's probably worth taking a little time to talk about this. There are a lot of questions from folks, again, coming back to refinances and using the alternative version of the CD. One of the questions was posed that certain transactions that are refinances may, at least from the perspective of some lenders today, work better, quote unquote, on the standard version than they do on the alternative. At this point, are there any considerations for exceptions to the delivery rule that might make it an option to use the standard version on refis? So maybe if each GSE could touch on that briefly, at least from what we know as of today.
Kathy, do you want me to start?
Sure.
Okay. We were rather deliberate in our study before making the decision of the requirement of the alternate form, and one of the things that the GSEs have done is to engage often and deliberately across industry. And what we heard from our lender partners, through advisory groups and through conferences and through engagement, with ALTA and all over the place, was that the alternate form and simplifying our data set so that the refinance using the alternate form would simplify the data set and simplify implementation for lenders so that they didn't have to implement the model form for both purchase and refinance and the alternate form for refinance. So that was the predominant thinking and was one of the things that influenced us in making that decision to use the alternate form. And particularly for GSE eligible transactions, we found that use of the alternate form was definitely the best solution and the most clear implementation using the alternate form. So we were receiving industry input in making that decision, and at this point in time, I don't foresee us making a change to that decision because it would involve quite a large change to the data set, and the entire industry is marching forward to prepare to deliver this data set to us within the next 10 months. Kathy, did you want to make additional comments?
I'll just chime in and echo what you said. It was a very deliberate decision. As Kelly said, we did consult with a number of different entities. The ones she listed, the CFPB as well, and it really did come down to what was the most clear and concise way to consume this data and the way to construct the data set itself. So we understand that, refinance on a model form gives some flexibility, which can be a good thing, but it also can cause a great amount of confusion, particularly when you're talking about standardized data and taking in and consuming that standardized data. So, agree with everything you said, Kelly. Again, it was a very thoughtful decision. I think
that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Kathy and Kelly. To expand upon this for a moment, will the GSEs or, to your knowledge, aggregators be providing additional or new guidance on how to place certain items on the alternate version of the CD? So, for example, questions come up around escrow rollovers, principal reductions, other type of this sort of miscellaneous credits that, again, I think are a reason some folks have leaned towards using the standard version in some of their transactions because of what the adjustments and other credits provides. Are there plans to provide additional guidance around how those types of items might be reflected in the alternate version of the CD?
Yeah, I'll start, Kelly, and then you could chime in if you'd like. So I believe let me answer it in a couple different parts. I think the first part of your question was, are you aware of aggregators providing direction to their correspondent lenders on how to handle these certain situations, such as gifts and grants for principal curtailments on the alternate form for a refi. And the answer is yes, I'm aware. I'm aware because we've had several conversations with several large lenders specifically on that topic. I'm not privy to the actual agreements between the aggregators and the correspondents, but I can tell you that we have had numerous discussions with aggregators on just that topic. As far as additional guidance goes, I'd take this opportunity to point out our implementation guide that we have on each of our websites. It's the same implementation guide for UCD. It's 300 and something pages, which sounds daunting, but it is. It's basically a how-to for the UCD, and it does address many of these circumstances. And I think that users or people that are implementing the UCD would find that very useful in not just this situation, but any situation that they are needing clarity. Kelly, anything to add?
No. Thank you, Kathy.
Great. Thank you so much for that additional elaboration. One question came up, and I'm happy to kind of address this one as well, and that is around if you're going to be required to deliver on the alternate version of the CD, does that not also mean that you have to have originally disclosed on the alternative version of the Ellie? And I just want to remind everybody that that's already an existing requirement under Reg Z, under Know Before You Owe, that you have to use a consistent version. So you can't mix and match, say, a standard LE with an alternate CD. So when we start working our way backwards and we think about delivery in September, you're really going to have to be very mindful of the applications you take in the months leading up to that. So for some of you that, for example, builders that come to mind that, may be taking applications today that are going to get delivered in September or October of next year, you might actually need to start capturing or doing those initial disclosures through the loan estimate today in order to ensure that they're on the right version of the CD for delivery next year. So I think that's one of the reasons why we felt this webinar was very timely, and why, from a system perspective, we've already released the functionality that we have, is really to facilitate. So again, for those that have long pipelines, what appears to be a next year requirement is really a now requirement that carries through next year. I don't know if Kathy or Kelly, if either of you wanted to append to that statement, but again, understanding that that's right, you have to use the alternate version of the Ellie on these refinances in your initial disclosures in order to use the alternate CD in the future.
Yeah, that's right, John. And at Freddie Mac, we have put out a couple of implementation timelines on our website, and you'll see that we actually recommend the same thing, that reminding people that the requirement is for loans with a note date of September 25th, so you need to be thinking about this right from the time of application. So, Kelly, anything you have?
No, I just echo your sentiments, and that, obviously compliance with the regulation is of course as important as anything here, that you do need to comply with CFPB's, TRID regulation, in addition to getting this data set right, so first and foremost.
Yeah, good point. I don't think a regulator's not going to give you a pass for switching versions because you had to deliver. You're going to have to make sure you do it right from the get-go. So what I'd like to do, because I know we're coming up on our last 10 minutes, I just want to kind of remind folks about some of the existing Encompass UCD functionality that's been released over the course of the last year. At Ellie Mae, we definitely took a somewhat unique approach to UCD requirement in that we've been involved through MISMO and working with both of the GSEs for the last several years. So for us, this requirement for UCD was not a know before you owe afterthought. It was actually something that we incorporated as sort of a backbone into what we were building when we developed our know before you owe solution. So when we were thinking about the fields we were going to add and the data points we were going to be collecting, one of the things we were always very mindful of was making sure that we were going to have the ability to provide an accurate and comprehensive UCD export. So just a reminder for those, I know the questions come up about, well, what if I develop the closing disclosure from a different system? What if it's a settlement agent that provides the CD, or I use a different doc prep company? It's worth mentioning as a reminder that Encompass does fully support producing the CD out of system. So that includes the standard version, the alternative version, the seller split version. So you can produce a final accurate closing disclosure from Encompass and have that given to your settlement agents and used at settlement. I do know we have a large number of lenders that are actually already doing that today. And to be honest with you, I think those lenders are going to have an advantage when it comes to UCD delivery because they're not going to have to worry about having different information in different systems. For those of you that are leveraging third parties or settlement service providers, we have spent a great amount of time over this last year and continue to work with settlement agents independently to improve their system-to-system connectivity through the Ellie Mae network, so that if you're at least placing orders and you are using the Ellie Mae network as a way of transferring data and documents between us and your settlement agents, there's already a channel to make sure that the information is going back and forth. So even if your system didn't produce the CD, it has all the information in the loan file that was used to produce the CD, so it can be leveraged in the export. Likewise, depending on the third-party doc prep provider integration you have, if they have the ability to write information back to the Encompass loan file, there's no reason why they can't, for example, put the seller information or settlement agent information back into that loan file that's being actually added to the CD itself. We have completed our system-to-system integrations with both Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. I know that here in December there's going to be a release from our TQL team that's going to talk about those specific integrations, so keep an eye out for that. We are also going to continue to provide the ability to generate the export from the pipeline. So you have the ability to, for example, save the XML and then upload it directly to one of the GSE portals. So that's going to be an option for you as well. There's been a lot of questions about what that export format is and how we quote-unquote embed a PDF into the export. One of the functionalities we delivered earlier this year was that you as a user can go into the E folder and indicate that either a CD that's a combined CD, so both borrower and seller, is final, or the ability to independently mark a borrower and seller CD as final. And the action of doing that indicator is actually what triggers what version of the CD we're going to embed into the export file, the XML, when it's produced. So basically, you're going to define ahead of time which CD is going to be embedded by indicating that within the E folder. And then when you go to produce the export, the system will automatically grab that PDF and embed it into the XML file. We talked earlier about the expanded data around contacts, including licensing information, authority information. That was actually all added into our file contacts last year. So the information's already there. If you have the ability to start saving that information at a file contact level, that'll make it so you can actually start that process of collecting that information today rather than waiting into next year. We also expanded the functionality around the summaries of transaction and as well as the adjustments and other credits so that you can capture more detailed, more granular information around those data points so that they can be as part of that export. So again, that's functionality in 16.3, so it's already available to many of you today. So you can start becoming familiar with collecting that expanded level of data. We made some comments earlier today around an ability to repay and QM, and just want to remind you that we already capture that information, including exemption information and QM type information and APOR and all those other data points we talked about earlier on one of the slides today, that between the ATR QM qualification screen or eligibility screen, a lot of that information is already being captured there, so no need to develop additional capture methods. And actually, that's been long-standing functionality for a couple of years now. And likewise, in the new itemization we delivered as part of our Know Before You Owe, the ability to have granular level detail about how each fee is incorporated into the QM points and fees threshold is available. Those are in those details for each of the fee pop-up windows that you have. So hopefully you'll see that a lot of the work we've been doing over the course of the last 2 years has all been directed towards this eventual implementation. So with that, we need to go ahead and start wrapping up. I'm going to take a quick look at additional questions that have come in while I was talking. But in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and pass it back over to Alyssa. She's got some other important information to share with you. And then time permitting, we'll try to see if there's any more Q&A. If not, look forward to more information directly coming from the GSEs. I strongly commend you to go to their websites, sign up for their email communications. This will give you the ability to stay up to date on information as it changes and evolves. And as we know, a lot of things can happen between now and September next year, so there's always the possibility, especially because we have that outstanding final rule that's not out yet, that obviously is going to have to be addressed and looked at to see if it has any impact on the actual use of the CD. So definitely you want to stay tuned in and connected to those information sources. So let me turn it back over to Alyssa.
Thank you, John. So we're providing some additional resources. Here are the websites that you can go and sign up for those email notifications directly from Fannie and Freddie Mac. Just a few other wrap-up items. Another very good way to stay informed, learn from industry peers, gain more insight from experts, and maximize your use of Ellie Mae is to attend Experience. This year it's March 6th through 8th, 2017. Registration is still open, and early bird registration is through December 16th, and I encourage you to register. This event typically sells out quickly.
Yeah, I just want to mention big material being covered this year. Not only are we going to be talking about UCD, we're going to be talking about the new loan application. We're going to talk about each of some of the GSE specific initiatives that we've been working on with both Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. This is absolutely going to be a phenomenal venue to not only hear from those agencies, but to talk to your peers about how they're implementing these as well. So I can't commend you enough to how important attending this year is going to be.
Great. Thank you for that plug there, John. So another good way to stay connected with us here at Ellie Mae are some other resources on Facebook, Twitter, and of course our phone line. With that, I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join us today. This concludes our webinar providing an overview of the Uniform Closing Dataset, UCD mandate. We look forward to meeting you at our next webinar. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
And just a special thank you to Kathy Scanlon with Freddie Mac and Kelly Vespucci for Fannie Mae for taking time out of their day to share this information with you. Hopefully you found it extremely useful. And if nothing else, you're now aware of what's going to be required of you next year, and you have some good questions and thoughts going into what you're going to do to make this a successful implementation. So as always, we thank you. Take care.